some jobs, like who you can have relationships with is just like extremely dictated. And even the conversation, like if you and I were working in a call center and you're sitting next to me, like I'm not supposed to talk to you, most likely. When I get on a phone call with a customer, like I've got a script that I'm probably supposed to follow. I'm not having an actual connection.
Welcome to Create New Futures, a show about thought-provoking ideas and practices you can use to create and shape your future in life and in business. Join Aviv Shahar, author and innovation strategy consultant, as he shares his proven strategies that have helped clients create breakthrough results. Aviv has guided executives at Fortune 100 companies, and now he wants to help you.
Welcome to Create New Futures, where we develop conversations with successful leaders and entrepreneurs and explore how you can create new futures for you and for your organization. This is Aviv, and today I'm speaking with Aaron Hurst. Aaron is the CEO and co-founder of Imperative, a peer coaching platform that unlocks the power of peers to support and help each other become increasingly more effective and fulfilled. Aaron is an expert on the science of purpose at work and the author of The Purpose Economy, how your desire for impact, personal growth, and community is changing the world. As the founder of the Taproot Foundation, he catalyzed the $15 billion pro bono service market. We're here to talk about his insights about learning and thriving at work through meaningful conversations, and about how the world of work is changing and is about to change in the coming decade. Aaron, it's great to have you here. Welcome.
Great to be with you. Excited for the conversation.
What have I missed in your introduction there?
So many different things and yet nothing. But I think the most important one is probably my most important job, which is as a parent of two incredible teenage kids here in Seattle, which I think is the cliche, but the most important job and the most important form of leadership.
That's awesome. So let me dive right in and ask you first, with all the things that you do at work and you get to get involved in, what do you enjoy the most and why?
I love that question. I was actually just doing a peer coaching conversation on this topic, so it's very fresh for me. But there's sort of two things that I love doing. One is invention. So when there's a challenge or an opportunity, trying to come up with a solution to that. It's problem solving sort of mashed up with design, I would say, as a activity. And then the second one is evangelism. Once you've got something you've invented, like you want everyone in the world to know about it because you're so excited about its potential. So those are the two things that I really get, energized by, which is, a good fit as an entrepreneur because that's a lot of what you're doing.
When did you recognize that you were by nature, by temperament, an evangelizer? Where would you trace that to?
I think it came up most when I was starting the Taproot Foundation. And Taproot Foundation was all about helping nonprofits by getting business professionals to donate their marketing, tech, HR skills. So in starting that, when I was recruiting people at companies, going and speaking at business schools, speaking at trade associations, trying to inspire people to their noble self to do pro bono work, I just found how much I loved telling that story and inspiring them and getting them to see something that they hadn't seen before and having that aha breakthrough moment of realizing they have so much more potential in the world. And I think that was just really addictive for me to do that. So that's probably the first professional time that I enjoyed, doing that. I think my first exposure to it as like a form of public speaking, which was a variation on that, was in high school doing Model United Nations and just having to take on the point of view of another country and their policy and having to give a compelling argument for that policy. I got so much energy out of doing that. Just thought that was so fun. So I think that was my earliest exposure, like as a child.
So we're going to flow here in this conversation up and down the timeline. We're not going to do a linear thing or chronological thing, which is great. You mentioned the Taproot Foundation.
Yep.
What was the idea and how it appeared with you in the first place that catalyzed and inspired you to create that approach?
Yeah. So the real sort of origin of it was I graduated from college and moved to Chicago and started working in inner city education at different nonprofits that were supporting teachers largely in the classroom. And after not too long, I got really frustrated because I saw that these nonprofits having the work they were doing is the most important work. The need was just so acute, but the ability to actually execute at any kind of scale to get there just wasn't happening. There wasn't that ability. And I looked around on Wacker Drive, looking at all these big buildings, and you're like, how are these companies able to scale something to go from a incredible small impact to a massive impact? And became really curious about that and realized I either wanted to go to business school or I wanted to go work in business and understand more about how businesses scale. And one of them cost money and one of them paid money. So I went with the let's go work inside an organization. And thinking about where's the best place to do that. I had family in Palo Alto, so moved to the Bay Area and started, got two different gigs, one for both of them for about 2.5 years as a first 10 employees at 2 venture-backed startups in the Bay Area, and sort of just saw that whole scaling process. That's really sort of at its purest form, that's quick scaling. And in reflecting back on it, it was really clear to me that money matters, but also that the skills that startups bring in are skills that generally nonprofits don't have. So nonprofits, don't usually have a CTO or a CMO or any of these other roles early on, whereas startups were hiring them in advance of the need so that they were able to basically pave the runway before they sort of grew up. So, sort of at the end of that journey, I said, I didn't come here to work in startups. I came here to actually help nonprofits with this need. So I started going out and talking to nonprofits about, what is it that you need? How can I help you? Because I know there's the skill gap. And the basic answer was, I have so many different needs and I need all this help with marketing and tech and HR and finance and all these things. And I was like, I can't do all that for you. And that's sort of where I had that aha moment, that invention moment of realizing that if I could create a scalable consulting firm that could do all this pro bono work for all the nonprofits, but using pro bono labor instead of paid labor, could actually scale an organization that could make a meaningful contribution to the nonprofit sector. And that was sort of that moment of realization where Taproot was really born out of that insight.
So for me, the special element in the story is you are in those startup opportunities and gigs, but you are staying tethered to your initial inspiration. You're not losing that sense of what brought you there in the first place, because often you'd get a young person into these environments and the excitement and the possibility and money takes over. What was it that enabled you to stay tethered to that sense of purpose and mission?
To be honest about it, I don't know that every single day that was the case. I think a lot of times you're solving the problem, you're working with your team, you're trying to get there. And both of the for-profit startups had a social oriented mission tied to them as well. One was a precursor to blogging and the idea of having everyone be able to create content and to be authors, which to me was an inspiring mission. And another one was about empowering people to take the first steps of homeownership. So I did find some sort of social value in those organizations. But to me, it was having family that's always been focused on social impact was really helpful. It just sort of kept on bringing it back to family values, to what I cared about. So I feel very grateful that I had that support system that kept me sort of honest to my values. So yeah.
I'm going to circle back to that and just your formation as an entrepreneur, as a CEO. But let me now lead and ask about imperative. And what was the insight that catalyzed the idea of imperative for you?
Yeah. So imperative has been a journey. So there's sort of multiple answers to that question. So the initial piece was, 10 years into Taproot, what I saw was that people were doing pro bono work to make their work meaningful because they didn't get meaning out of their work. And I sort of had this aha moment that I was in the vitamin business instead of healthy food business. And I was like, I don't really want to continue to just help people have an excuse to eat McDonald's and then have their vitamins. I want them to actually eat the healthy meal. And I want to focus on how do I help support that? How do we make all work feel like pro bono work was sort of my design challenge at the time. So, wrote the purpose economy as a way for me of exploring, what is it going to take to make that possible? Reviewing the research, looking at the business value of all work becoming meaningful, because it's not just for the social impact. It was it had to be a business imperative. And then we started looking at what is the technology necessary to make this possible? Because the current tech stack in workplace is designed for work to be efficient and about pushing information around. It is not fundamentally built for human beings. And it tends to be written by people who are not very socially oriented and are just sort of looking at work very much like a set of human resources to be optimized. And basically started on this journey doing research with my alma mater at Michigan, NYU, LinkedIn, PwC, different partners, trying to figure out what were positive deviants doing? What were people doing that was different than everybody else that enabled them to be fulfilled? What were these practices that they did? And with a thought of like, we can take that then and we can amplify that. And there are two practices that really emerged. One was people who are fulfilled at work, and this is going to shock you, they tend to know what fulfills them. So it's sort of not surprising once you hear it, but the reality is generally like K-12 and higher ed doesn't teach us the answer to that question. A lot of the assessments out there, they teach you what your strengths are, they teach you what your personality is. They don't really teach you like what fulfills you. And I realized that I had insights and could do the research to actually determine the psychological drivers of purpose so that we could build a tool that would, within 10 minutes, enable every employee to know what their purpose is. So we built that first, and that was very successful, rolling that out, around the world. And then the second insight was that wasn't enough. People had to have a support system to constantly bring them back, to your point, bring them back to their purpose. So they didn't just continue sort of on their, conveyor belt that they're on, but they actually took that step back. And we realized that they were not doing it with coaches. They weren't doing it with managers. They weren't doing it with HR. It was actually, they were doing it with their peers. The people who were fulfilled, built peer networks that they regularly did job crafting with. They reflected on their emotions. They reflected on what was going on at work, and they came up with ideas for how they were going to show up differently. And we realized that was really the key ingredient to the future of work, was supporting peer and coaching networks inside businesses where people are supporting each other to basically craft their job on a continuous basis to be fulfilled. So that's the long answer to your question.
Well, there is so much there for me to unpack, because let's just stay with the purpose and inquiry and then come back to the peer coaching. As somebody that used to take people on a 3 and 4 days retreat in some of the largest, most admired companies in the world for purpose discovery and to develop their passionate purpose and their core values, and then build and design a design for their life as to how to realize that. I'm intrigued that you say that you could help people in 10 minutes discover the purpose. So what are some of the core principles that insight and the tool was developed on?
Yeah. So if you think about it, if you went and looked at all the people you worked with, right, and all the purpose statements that they articulated, if you look at all those and you started to look at how are they, they're all different in their language, their poetry, but if you look at what are the actual differences that are being articulated, you start to see that there's really 3 elements that tend to emerge in every purpose that's articulated well. And, we've tested this in a lot of different ways. And one is really, we saw there was a psychological difference in the elevation that people wanted to make an impact. Some people are totally fulfilled helping a person or individuals. For others, they need to feel like their impact is at a societal level. And there's sort of a continuum there. And that has a huge impact on, what would come out of one of your workshops. The second one is that most people's purpose at some level ties back to how their work makes the world more fair and more just. And there you see, and this is very well researched, there's a continuum of how people are pre-wired around their point of view on what does fairness mean. And actually the definition of what's fair is at the heart of someone's purpose. That's really what they're trying to do, is make the world fair. And this ties back to very sort of traditional ideas around, 2 different polar ends. One is this idea that fairness has to do with basically free markets and enabling, that's what's fair. And the other side, fairness has to do with helping other people and making sure no one's left behind. And there's a continuum, but that has a huge impact on then the definition. And then the final, which is the most sort of, I think, understood, is much more around what is the primary way you solve problems? Because typically in a purpose statement, there's an articulation of what is your role in that. And we found those tend to fall into 4 buckets as well. I won't go into all that detail, but when you combine those things, you could basically assemble 24 different purpose statements that we saw, even with people like yourself who'd done this work forever, they would do it and be like, it's not the exact same words, but you completely got the sentiment behind it. And what's cool about that is that because it's data driven, you can start to do predictive analytics to say, if your purpose is X, we know in this situation, you're likely going to want to do Y. which is very different than if you just do it through what I call like a more poetic coaching environment. And you can start to look at combinations. So if you have these people with all these different purpose types, how are they going to start to show up differently? How do you need to structure goals differently? So it enables a type of scale that wasn't possible before.
So let me just explore a number of facets and tell me if those are in any way, shape, or form integrated into this. Where is the place and the sense of meaning for you in the inquiry of purpose? Is it one and the same or not? Or how do you place the sense of meaning?
Yeah, I mean, we talk about a couple of different terms. There's like purpose, there's meaning, there's fulfillment, right? So when we're doing work that's aligned with our purpose, it is meaningful. That's sort of how we think of it. Sort of like the meaning comes out as an output from doing the work that's purposeful. It has meaning. And actually, we found that unless you're aware of what fulfills you, no matter what you do, your work's generally not fulfilling, because the actual act of meaning is that you have to give meaning to something. Nothing is inherently meaningful. It's only in the process of reflection that you create meaning for something. So when you're able to tie the awareness about your purpose to the work you're doing, then you sort of say, this is meaningful. And then fulfillment, we found, is really the emotional state that you have when your work is meaningful. You feel fulfilled. And that's been a big part of our advocacy work, is helping to change the narrative in corporations from employee engagement, which is a management perspective, to employee fulfillment, which is what employees want. It's just sort of trying to just create that shift.
Where do you place in this cosmology of ideas the significance of happiness, of joy?
Happiness and joy, I think, are interesting. So the way I like to think about fulfilling work is it's a lot like parenting. And it's not all joy. There are moments of joy, but those moments of joy are, moments of struggle, frustration, going through a journey together. I think it's really important that we don't see life as just continuous act of happiness and joy. Like, that's not the right goal. Meaning often does not come from joy or happiness. So I try to generally, I think it's a very American concept, try to push people a little bit away from that as the goal and have them connect to the moments when they felt fulfilled, which could have come after something that was very difficult and painful.
Right.
But those are, incredibly valuable as well.
Positive psychology offers 3 different kind of happiness, dimensions of happiness. It is the giggly happiness of the moment. It is that sense of meaning that you speak to in the sense of when you are fulfilled at work. And it is that third element, which is when you lose the sense of time and you are in some kind of a flow state. So where do you place the desire to be in that creative zone, to explore and enter flow states? Do you believe that they show up when you are in the zone of fulfillment, or how do you place that?
I think when you're working in alignment with your purpose and that is your natural flow. So by definition, like, you're much more likely to be in that state of flow as you define it. The other thing is that the definition I often gave that people found helpful was of those 2 different, like, broadly the 2 different kinds of happiness. I get that there's the 3, but that the first one is like carbohydrates and sugar.
Yep.
And the second one is protein. And they both generate energy, but it's a very different type of energy and very different nutritional value. And that there's, value to both, but you wouldn't want a diet of all sugar and carbs.
Right. And a different collateral health or damage as a result of both. Let me explore 2 more additional elements in this. One is the spiritual and the other is the developmental. Did you overlay your research with some developmental theory and developmental stages, and do they impact and change in any way that sense of fulfillment at work?
There's 2 different pieces. So we looked at it in terms of like what someone's purpose is. We found that that's pretty stable. It's more a question of people's self-awareness. So typically when someone changes their articulated purpose, it's not because they've changed, they've just become more self-aware about who they are. So I think of it more as like peeling back the onion, and that they, are fundamentally shifting. What we did see a bigger difference is what we framed as a term called purpose mindset. And what we saw was that there's actually a mindset tied to people who tend to be fulfilled, where the role that they see work playing in their life is different than other people. Some people see their work as being about, just a financial transaction. Some people it's about ego, and there's others who see it as being about, creating value and being fulfilled. And those people are much more likely to be fulfilled. No surprise there. And we did see that you saw more of a correlation there over time in terms of people shifting on that. And generally, as you got older, people were more likely to be purpose oriented or purpose driven. And women were significantly more likely than men to be purpose driven. So, and the most purpose driven category is basically women over 50. That's where you had like the sort of pinnacle of that, which actually is like one of the most discriminated against segments of the workforce. So it's interesting in this context, like in many ways, the most valuable employees are the ones that are least valued.
So implicit in this insight is that the purpose mindset is something that a person can cultivate, can develop, and can evolve over time.
Yes, and so I think that's right. We did some early research, which wasn't definitive, but it pointed to signs that there were actually like specific psychological problems that tended to cause the first two states. So generally, we saw people who were in the money mindset, like work as a necessary evil, generally had fundamental issues that they didn't trust the world. And those tend to tie back to very early childhood, based on secondary research on that. And therefore, like they're not going to give the power to their work to be more than that because they don't trust the world. And then the people who see work as largely about career and performance and like proving yourself tended to have fundamental issues with identity and self-worth, where they felt like they needed that to show up at their high school reunion and feel like they were successful because they didn't have enough identity for themselves without that work being that identity for them. So they can develop, but they have to work through. My hypothesis is you have to work through those psychological changes. You can't just say, this is the better state to be in. You're like, yep, great, I'll do that. It's actually about addressing those underlying psychological issues that create that change.
Well, actually, the way you define these three mindsets, they correlate very nicely with different developmental states. So, and naturally supportive for that. The last dimension to explore is the spiritual. I don't mean in that sense the religious dimension, even though that is by itself an interesting inquiry too. So let me ask you both about the religious and spiritual in the way different people define these terms. Have you found any correlation in any way in the way you were building the map of meaning of purpose at work?
Not really, to be honest with you. Like I think a lot of the early work in purpose is done through different faiths. And I think that's often where people look to do this type of work. Like a lot of the reason people go to synagogue or church or what have you is for that pure support and reminder of like what matters. So I think I thought of it more in the sense of like what we were doing is creating a secular alternative to that, where people could do that exploration and they would have the support of a community to keep bringing them back to what matters and that intentionality. But from a psychological standpoint, like looking at, are people more likely to be spiritual if they're purpose driven, purpose oriented? We did some early looks at that, and there was correlation there. I think that's not surprising, but not any deeper than that.
So let's now look at this idea of peer coaching and the distinction you made earlier. How did you discover that, and how do you differentiate actually between peer coaching? Is it structured? Is it not very structured? And how do you make those distinctions between the mentoring, the other kind of coaching modalities, to the one you focus on in catalyzing peer coaching?
I mean, we took a lot from different practices, from therapists to coaches to mentoring, and sort of looked at all those, but really thought about it. Like, let's look at the behavioral science like at its core and not be too influenced by those existing models. Let's actually look at the science behind it. And there are a bunch of key differences. And one of the things I would start with is, what we've built with our platform is really a continuous process. Our belief is not that you need a coach for a month and then you're done. Our belief is that coaching should be a continuous process throughout your career, from school all the way through to retirement and beyond. And it's a process that is going to be critical, especially going forward in the workplace, because with so much change constantly happening in the world, with so much stress going on in the world, people need that continuous support mechanism for them. So it's a continuous motion versus like a solve for or a skill building model. So that's sort of one. Second piece is that we design the whole process. It's not about advice giving, which is what mentoring tends to be. This whole process is about two people coming together to reflect on what's going on, talk about sort of the dynamic of that, and tie it to their own reflection about what matters to them, and to identify a change they're going to make every 2 weeks to enable their success. And the goal is to help people solve their own problems, not solve it for them. Whereas I think most corporate cultures and most of our culture in general is a problem solving mindset. And this is much more like help people actually empower them to solve their own challenge. Third thing is it is peer. So by being peer, it changes the power dynamic, which mentoring does. You've got power dynamic issue. So you're actually able to share stories at the same level about what you're doing, that actually those stories are of high value to each other. So it's not.
This is a reciprocity.
That's right.
Based conversation.
That's right.
Both, each side is helping the other side.
Yep, exactly. And continuously. And a lot of it's just by hearing someone else's journey and story. It builds this empathy. It creates ideas. There's tremendous value in that. So that would be sort of the next thing I would share. And then it's got benefits that you wouldn't see in those other modalities. So one is we found that after doing peer coaching on our platform for 1 quarter, people report having a meaningful relationship they've built with someone who's typically a stranger to them inside their company. So you're starting to build networks and break down silos inside an organization through this, which is incredibly important. You're starting to build inclusion. So building a relationship with a coach doesn't really do much for you from a inclusion and relationship standpoint. But when you're suddenly having a partner who's different than you are in some dimension, and you're humanizing them and creating that sense of belonging, you're seeing a significant ripple effect. And you're also seeing on a psychological level, like one of the most important things to mental health and to being open to change is meaningful conversation and peer connection, like that kind of intimate connection. So it's actually in of itself like a mental health booster for folks. And we see that coming out of conversations as people's energy gets elevated, their optimism gets elevated. And that's because of the oxytocin release tied to that kind of conversation. So there's a lot of like pretty fundamental difference. We really see this as less like a program or a sort of part of a journey and more of just a continuous part of the flow of the future of work.
What kind of scaffoldings and support and tools do you provide for those one-on-one interactions?
Yeah, so a lot is the answer. So it starts off with, we do the purpose profile for everyone, which is then used for matching. So we do the matching of them. They then go into a video interface. We're posing specific dynamically generated questions that they each ask each other. Each of those has a follow-up question. So it's helping them dig deeper. And then it's also surfacing insights from their purpose profile. So if we know all these things about someone based on that. So when they're answering questions, we can like pop up and be like, struggling with this question, here are some ways that you may think about it. And we're finding that's been really critical to help people dig deeper and to get them to true insights about themselves. And then at the end of each conversation, they're making a pledge of a commitment they're going to make to their colleague, of something they're going to do. So we're able to provide the scaffolding of making sure those are well articulated and thoughtful. And then 2 weeks later, when they reconnect, checking in so we can actually look at the accountability and the impact of the actions that they're doing. So it's pretty robustly scaffolded. They're also taking notes for each other as they go. So you have a whole history of notes from your coaching partner from all your sessions that you can refer back to. So you have that resource.
And these work virtually or in person or both?
Virtual. So our assumption is that, whether people are working from home or not, like you're trying to build bridges between offices, between different departments, et cetera. So virtual is a much more effective way to do that. And it's interesting, we've actually found in a lot of ways, it's been more successful than in person.
Higher level of intimacy.
High level of intimacy.
Higher level of intimacy and safety in the virtual.
That's exactly right. And there's less of like worrying about what you look like, what you smell like, how you're showing off. It's more comfort we're finding for a lot of people in that environment.
Is there a time component? These are 45 minutes, these are an hour, these are 30 minutes.
They're each about an hour. We found that's about how long it takes to check in on your past goal, do the sort of reflection, and then come up with a new outcome. So it's about an hour every 2 weeks, and then you switch partners every quarter. So over the course of a year, you have 20 conversations, but with 4 different partners. So it starts to build your network inside the business or inside the organization.
So it's always inside the same company? So let me ask you now, so what is the business model? How do you make money in a business like this?
Yeah, so we're a venture-backed tech startup. So we are a SaaS business model. So, a company like Hasbro license imperative. We have an enterprise license with Hasbro, for example, for all their employees to be on the platform. And the size of that contract is based on how many employees they have as a company. So we're about 9 months into the deployment of this, so sort of go to market, and we've got, clients.
So you just went into market mid-pandemic. It's like the ideal perfect thing
Yeah.
for
No. Yeah, we started working on it in 2019, but it was really, we had to raise venture capital to like really go beyond prototype into the true build, and then had alpha and beta clients. And then in Q4 of 2020, like really went to market and have just seen incredible response. I mean, everyone from Microsoft, Target, Zillow, Boston Scientific, some really large brands are embracing this and exploring it as part of how they're thinking about the new operating system for work.
Have you inquired into the modality of groups of threes or groups of four? This is just since I'm in the business of designing transformational experiences, I've developed a unique set of insights about what happens in a one-on-one situation with the mirroring neurons, but what then happens with threes, with fours, with fives. Have you explored any of that on the platform?
We did in prototyping. What we found was it's partially logistical, which is if you want people to schedule these sessions, every person you add is exponentially harder to find the time, and they're much more likely to fall apart and start to like degrade. So with two people, like scheduling is one of the biggest challenges for this type of work. So just minimizing that. I think also just from that intimacy perspective of trying to really build a network and a sense of psychological safety, the dynamic between two people is very different than three. The safety is very different than with three, for example. There's lots of benefits to 3, 4, 5 as well, but just from the pure like coaching value of creating safety, of creating a deep connection between two people, we felt like it was the better modality. I do think 3, 4, those things work. I just think they're much harder to scale, and they're less predictable in terms of the dynamic within them.
They need more guided or structured scaffold to enable the flow to be predictable. So let's use it.
There's the safety piece too of like, you start to wonder like, oh, does this person like that person more than me in this session? And you start to get a little bit more into performative and anxiety that comes when you start getting beyond two people, which is really interesting as well.
So let me actually ask there, what else do you do to promote, to encourage the authenticity of the conversation? Is that part of those scaffoldings in the prompts and the questions? And that is partly helping people relax into a deeper sense in themselves and discover the safety?
Yeah, I think a lot of it's because it's all based on the purpose science, and that people are being fed these insights about them from a purpose perspective, that tends to put people in a mindset that's more abundance oriented, more service oriented, more best self oriented. And when they hear someone else validate that, they feel seen. So it really accelerates that process pretty significantly. We also we use the research by Arthur Aronson on how to get strangers to fall in love, which is that reciprocity back and forth. In his research, he figured out basically how to accelerate, just get two people to feel that sense of being in love, which largely has to do with feeling seen. And how do you actually accelerate that trust in a relationship? And we found that to be just like extremely effective.
In what way have you been transformed in your relationship with the people in your life since you have launched Imperative and been on this journey?
Well, I think from as a user perspective, it's been hard for me because I don't really have peers in my company because I'm the CEO, and it's like the one role that there definitely isn't more than one of. But I've still, used the platform a lot with the team. Sort of it's not the use case that it's built for, but I do it anyway. And I think it really has humbled me. It's enabled me to get to know the people on the team in a way I never would have before. And I'd always talk about, valuing people, and I thought I meant it, but I realized I didn't mean it as much as I thought I did. And that actually, as I got to know people's ambitions and hopes and fears and their interests and their, the day-to-day things they're struggling with, and I started to do that, I realized I started to see them as people at a much deeper level. And I think that's just been humbling for me, and just something I feel it's like a depth that's added to my life that I really value. I think the other thing is a humility around, I think working largely in the, tech startups early, and then, in the nonprofit sector, I think I always thought creating a new business was not that hard a thing to do. I think I've been very humbled by, there are a million reasons a business can just fail. And no matter how talented the team is, no matter what's going on, you just sort of realize how fragile these organizations are, and how many variables and stars have to align for something to actually be successful. And I look at other entrepreneurs and people who've built successful businesses, I think with a lot more awe than I did before. So that's been really that's been wonderful as well.
Well, I'm tempted here to go to the beginning of the journey then and ask you both on, you mentioned that earlier in life you were surrounded by people and in your upbringing social impact was meaningful. So I'm interested, can you be a little more specific? What was it that especially inspired you earlier on in life? And then where in this story, this idea that you may lead, you may create a company, you may become an entrepreneur yourself, where do you get this idea, this thought that, yes, this is something you may be able to do?
Yeah, so my immediate family and sort of core family sort of all socially oriented, I think, overall. So my dad was in higher education administration and like really focused on how do you optimize the culture of universities to help them be successful. My mother was a sort of more like arts oriented, was a belly dancer, an astrologist. She sort of was did a lot of different things. She worked in Mexico helping sort of create cooperatives for women to be able to support themselves. In the extended family, my grandfather was the original sort of author of the strategy for the Peace Corps for President Kennedy, and was a big part of the Marshall Plan and the rebuilding of Germany after the war. And then was basically de facto founding CEO of the Aspen Institute and ran that for 25 years. So that was a big, influence on me. And sort of the Aspen Institute's really about bringing people of different perspectives together to solve problems. So that played a major role, I think, in my upbringing. Broader extended family, very involved very early on in the environmental movement. I mean, my wife today sort of runs all of sustainability for Amazon. So that's sort of it's very, very close to what matters to me as well. So that was, I think, the social impact piece of it. That was what I understood. And that was what success was. It was not about money. It was about, how are you helping make other people's lives better? The entrepreneurship thing, I didn't have a label for it, but my first entrepreneurial endeavor, actually, before I even had that, I remember my aspiration when I was like in middle school in terms of like what I wanted to do professionally, I was always drawn to James Bond villains because they always had these like really like huge ideas for like often for like changing the world that obviously all had like a very dark side to them and were not positive like in the end. But I just always loved that, like that massive world changing aspiration that a lot of them represented, which I remember sort of in several of those movies rooting more for the Bond villain than I was for Bond. And my first business I started actually was when I was 16, where I was exposed to the idea of wholesale, which to me was like the most exciting thing ever. So I was really into baseball and baseball cards, and would go to the card dealership, the card shows that would be at Union Halls around Detroit, because I was living in the Detroit area. And you buy cards and you trade cards and what have you. And then I learned that if you actually paid $10 and had a table and sat on the other side, you could buy things at half the price. To me, it was like this amazing epiphany that you could buy things wholesale. So I, took my collection, put it on it, paid my $10, sat on the table, and then I started being able to buy up other people's collections and cards at half of the retail price, and just got really into it. And every weekend would have, my table set up, would, practice merchandising, practice like all these different ways of like, how do you sell your cards in a competitive environment? And also just loved interacting with customers, especially they were not people who I would have interacted with in my normal world. It was a lot of like folks from auto industry and sort of much more blue collar than my family and environment. So just love that. So that was my first like exposure, I think.
That's where you're discovering that you have the genes or whatever it is for business and for commerce.
Yeah. And I didn't know, I didn't have a label for it. I just knew that I love that. And I just found like through high school, like I just was always the one starting new clubs. I was always the one creating new things. That's sort of how I operate. Like I create more than I do. One of my favorite examples of that was living in the Bay Area. I really wanted to play more tennis. And I thought I could use Craigslist, which was bigger at the time, to help find folks and just put out like, hey, does anybody want to play tennis in Dolores Park? And I think I got like 60 responses. And this is amazing. Like, I can't play with all of you, but let me match you all together. And pretty quickly, I had created the Dolores Park Tennis League. At any given time at Dolores Park, like half the people playing were from this network I'd created of people playing tennis. And I never once played tennis in that as part of that.
So this is an example. This is a story about what it's not a business, but an opportunity finding you rather than you seeking the opportunity.
Yeah, which I think almost always happens. It's like you run into something and you see you sort of have that aha moment of potential. Yeah.
So at what point are you beginning to grapple with turning opportunities like this and then the foundation into an organizational success, and you're grappling with who are the people that I need to bring on the team and developing that management and leadership and team leadership mindset? Describe to me a little bit of that journey and some of the key insights there.
It's not, I think in most cases, I don't set off to do anything. I get inspired by an idea and I want to sort of see if I can invent something to solve for it. And some of those inventions you realize have a much bigger opportunity, and that to actually realize the potential of that invention, like you need an organization behind it and you need to build something. And in some cases you say that's a nonprofit from a tax status perspective and how you design it. And, in the case of what I'm doing now, I'm like, the only way you can build B2B software and scale it is being venture backed. That's how that works. So you choose that as the model. I did not set out saying I want to create a venture-backed tech company. Like that was never on my aspirational list of anything. It is the path for this invention and this aspiration. So that's sort of where that came from. So with each of them, it flowed from the invention. So with Taproot, I started off, I said, I have this idea. Again, Craigslist, because that was the way you communicated back then. I posted saying, hey, I have got this idea. Does anyone want to work on this with me? And just got tons of people saying, hey, I'm happy to work full-time for free. I'm happy to help with this. I'm happy to get my company's resources behind this, and started to sort of see this momentum behind it. And then you start to say, okay, this is something that needs that next level of infrastructure. And then you sort of see the broader opportunity, the vision, and you start to think about what is the container that can make that happen. And I think that's where I'm very different than I think a lot of entrepreneurs, especially in the business world, where I see a lot of it's, where are there business opportunities to make money is the sort of starting place for a lot of the people I talk to. Whereas to me, it's the invention, and then what is the right home for that invention?
Is the implicit message there that you are to be there at the beginning, the creation phase, but you're likely to move on when it needs a professional management to institutionalize the place, or no, you could get interested in that next phase as well?
But yes, it's both. So I think at that next phase, once you've got proof of concept, go to market, figure it out, I think my role moves less into management, more on leadership is how I think about it. And you need to bring in that management layer. That's making sure you're scaling and you're delivering things on time and predictability. You need to bring in that layer. But I still think that as a CEO, I can bring a lot of value as a leader who is evangelizing to the employees and to the outside world, who is keeping people inspired. So I feel like that role continues. The role shifts from inventor into more of evangelist. And I think the tricky part is letting go of a lot of that invention and letting other people take control of that, and focusing more on the evangelism, and then trying to figure out for me personally, how do I still get that invention need met for myself? Because if I don't have that for too long, evangelism is not enough for me.
Mm. If you're extraordinarily successful, where will you be 5 years from now with Imperative?
So our goal is to be 5 years from now doing 1 million conversations a day on the platform. So just sort of thinking about if I'm, 1 million hours of peer coaching happening every day, companies around the world. At that point, I feel like we're going to actually see a shift in the culture and the expectations of the workplace. So I think about success in that way. It's like a critical mass of, volume of people doing this every single day. That's the primary measure. I think from a business perspective, 5 years from now, I would want to be close to 100 million in revenue, or well on our way to that. And to have, had pretty deep penetration in a number of major verticals where this just becomes sort of de facto how, work is done in those industries. And that if you took a job somewhere that didn't have it in that industry, you'd be like, this is crazy. You don't have healthcare. Sort of benefits would be the equivalent of not having peer coaching as part of, your idea of what work should be and what the benefits are as a company.
So do you have a big theory of the case in terms of the evolution of the experience at work and where we are and why this is meaningful now and where and how the world of work is changing in the coming decade?
Yeah, I think a lot of it's, the seeds for it are all already here. And I think a lot of it's come out of crises, which has become more clear to me, coming out of the pandemic. But I saw in starting Taproot around 9/11, people's quest for meaning. They were saying they saw these first responders, saw people doing, this great work. They're like, what does my work matter? What am I doing for meaning? So there's this huge push there. We saw with the financial meltdown in '08, people stopped having the same trust in work in their employer. They used to have, it was a huge push around autonomy and people being more autonomous in their choices. You saw the rise of things like Uber and Airbnb, all these sort of autonomy-driven career paths. And then what we've seen with the pandemic is this huge push for need for human connection and mental health as being two fundamental shifts that have happened. So I look at the future of work, I think it's a combination largely of those things: optimized for meaning, optimized for autonomy, optimized for connection, and optimized for mental health. So if you look at like, what does that mean sort of as a go forward? I think it's a lot about how do you empower people to self-manage with the support of peers versus the traditional model, which has been very hierarchical and about your manager being the one who's managing you and responsible for your success. I think especially as organizations are more and more agile and much more network-based, we're going to see much more of the tools go into the hands of the employee versus the manager, and that the network connections are what's going to support them in their work. We're going to see a lot more focus on the fact that, and actually I was just listening to a podcast Brene Brown did on burnout, just saying like, we're first and foremost emotional creatures that think sometimes. And I think work right now and all the systems are designed assuming we're thinking creatures who unfortunately have these annoying emotion things on the side. And I think what we're going to see as we understand more and more about the psychology and motivation in the workplace is that we're going to see a shift in the workplace where emotion is going to become a much bigger part of how we design the work experience, and not just assume people are, thinking robots who just solve problems. And that's going to have a ripple effect in the systems needed.
How will we reconcile those two gaps? First, that there are many jobs that are probably not going to be fulfilling and are not going to be purpose tethered for people. And second, people that want to do all sorts of things because of the sense of purpose and meaning and fulfillment that perhaps cannot be expressed in a work-related or in a business or money-making context. How will we solve these two gaps?
I mean, first of all, I'd say we've found people who found meaning and purpose in every job we've ever studied. So it's possible in every job. And I think that's one of the things we have to clearly define, is that it is possible. It largely has to do with two variables. One is just sort of mindset. And the second one is generally is tied to a level of autonomy. When people have very low autonomy jobs is really where you see the lowest levels of fulfillment, because you don't have room to move. It's fundamentally different.
Just to clarify that, do you view autonomy and connection as polarity, or do you view those as two vectors that sometimes create a higher degree of overlap, but sometimes are on the completely two ends?
What was it? Sorry, autonomy, and what was the other one you were saying?
Connection.
Because
you identify those as two important vectors.
I think it's like they have to come together as a model. I think it's complicated, I guess, is the answer. So you think about autonomy, some jobs, like who you can have relationships with is just like extremely dictated. And even the conversation, like if you and I were working in a call center and you're sitting next to me, like I'm not supposed to talk to you, most likely. When I get on a phone call with a customer, like I've got a script that I'm probably supposed to follow. I'm not having an actual connection with a human being. So I think about that as it's a highly social, but incredibly non-connected and low autonomy role, which is why there's such burnout and dislike for those, kind of jobs. So that's, I would look at it in that sense, that if you don't have autonomy in a certain way, you can't make connections, period. I think there are other jobs where there's low autonomy, but there's still the ability to have that level of connection, where you see people in an environment where they're working side by side and there's interaction that's constantly happening, and there's low autonomy on certain aspects of the job, but not necessarily in the social interaction that's part of it. So I think you just need to think about it differently, I guess, just depending on the circumstance, like how the autonomy and connection fits in.
And the premise and the belief is gradually, increasingly, we'll have people moving into management and leadership that are increasingly embracing the mindset that you are describing. But at the moment, you do need to sell the solution and its value and its impact to senior leaders.
Although I think since I wrote The Purpose Economy and really sort of beating the drum around purpose, seeing like a fundamental shift, I think, in executives and their understanding of the importance. And Microsoft, locally here in Seattle has been a great example of that. I think the pandemic accelerated that, where I think most executives are understanding the need for connection and the psychological part of work much better. And then, from a generational standpoint, millennials get this way more than older generations. And, as the subsequent generations sort of emerge, that need is even more and more acute. So I think it's just going to get easier with every year as you see those changes happening. But I would say also, there is fundamentally something going on in the workplace which is very, very negative, which is very obvious. It's just there is more and more of these like separation between people who have low autonomy jobs and high autonomy jobs, people who have high paying jobs and low paying jobs. These things are all they're very connected. I think the future of work for the low autonomy, low paid jobs right now does look pretty bleak. I think some of that, there's hope in certain paths. I do less work in that domain to be able to speak too heavily to what, I think the future of work is for those folks. I think a lot of those jobs will be automated. It'll become a question then of what do they do? I think the other major piece will be, which I talk about when I have to do keynotes, is the things that are going to be automated are things where it's like a repeated process that produces predictable outcomes, right? And that's generally what you can automate because you can create rules around how that behavior works. That's also the definition of a professional. So if you think about what makes someone a doctor compared to someone else, is that they can do the same procedure multiple times and get the same output. If you think about what a lawyer is, that's the same thing. All these roles that have been the most, highly sought after paid jobs are actually in a lot of cases exactly the definition of what can be automated through AI. So a big part of what I also have been pushing about the future of work is that we start tying our identity more to our purpose and less to a profession, because professions, I think, are going to be a dying framework, because it's by definition what's going to be done more and more through technology.
That's a fascinating reframe. And you find with leaders that people are prepared to embrace that mindset shift that you're proposing.
I think they're starting to. I think there's a recognition that change is happening, the AI side of it, and the move away from that. And there's a recognition that people need to have a growth mindset, which is basically this idea that I'm not a doctor. I am a person who likes to make this kind of impact and to solve problems this way, so that, if that job goes away, I can go and do something else. So I think there's a recognition of that pretty significantly. I don't think most doctors or lawyers or what have you have faced yet the reality of what's afoot.
You're predicting or foreseeing a future where all proceduralists are out of job. You are there to create different kind of value, different kind of meaning. And we are either one way or another engaged in a creative or inventive or transformative role, or we're out of work.
Yeah, it's like creative piece. I say, if you want to do well, be as unprofessional as possible. That's sort of a cheeky way of sort of expressing that. But no, I think that is key. It's going to be that human quality. And therefore, we have to define people's identities more and more about the humanity instead of these artificial sort of professional labels that are by definition fixed mindset.
The one last distinction I'll make there when you talked about growth mindset is, it sounds to me that you're even more describing learning mindset. In my work, I make the distinction, the two. When we truly show up in an environment where we are all prepared to coach each other, which is the one you promote with peer coaching. We are low on ego. We are low on the need to prove that we already know. We are more on showing up every day to discover what it is we can learn today and how we can make each other better. And that is a different way of being wired and engaging at work. So very exciting.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think it's I personally don't love growth mindset as a frame. I think it can be, there's a lot of people who you would not find to be very, people you admire who would have a growth mindset. I think it does tend to tie towards ego and utility. That's why I tend to talk about a purpose mindset, which sort of takes the idea of growth mindset and you add to it a point of view and values. So it's grow towards what? General growth is not a good thing. It's growth towards something and having a purpose behind it. And that it's not just about you. It's about being in service of others and adding value. So it's not just about achievement, which I think a lot of the growth mindset tends towards an achievement mindset behind it. So I find reframing it as purpose mindset is really helpful for people.
I imagine the other hurdle to overcome with the purpose reframe is that people have internalized over the last couple of decades purpose at different layers. So some companies, some of the large companies that I've helped, initially talked about purpose more as a social responsibility, afterthought addition. First, we make money and then we'll do something good for society at large. But you're describing something very different. You're describing an organization of people where each person in some way is able to produce that internal alignment from their life, who they are, what they believe in, to what they do at work, to the larger impact that they create. That's a completely deeper, more profound level of alignment.
Yeah, I make the comparison just in doing talks about the purpose economy, is like with the information economy, and I was there early days in Silicon Valley, you had a lot of companies that said, got it, I'll build a website, right? That was sort of their response to it. And others ones said, oh crap, like this changes every single aspect of my business. And they just went through that digital transformation process. And if you look at the companies that thrived coming out of that era, it was not the ones that just thought it meant building a website was enough to say that you are now, digital. I think the same thing's true with this new era that I'm calling sort of purpose economy. You can just give your employees volunteerism and philanthropy. That's the equivalent of giving them the website. Or you can realize that like every single aspect of your business needs to change as much in this era as it did in the information economy around digital transformation, and realize it's that scale of transformation that we're talking about.
Fascinating. 3 closing questions. With all that you know today, what advice would you give your 25-year-old self?
I have a new mantra about myself, which is to try to avoid giving advice. I find it's not very helpful. But I think if I had to give advice to myself at 25, I think it's the obvious one, but just relationships are the most important part of life and work.
Let's just stay with your mantra. So what is replacing advice?
It's coaching. It's helping people solve their own problems for themselves.
A true, genuine interest and curiosity about how the other person is growing, learning, evolving, and developing.
Yeah, the research shows people who give advice get a lot more out of it than the people who get the advice. And that there's a lot of dysfunction around advice giving in our society.
Fascinating. If you were to lose all that you know and only keep 2 ideas or 2 practices or 2 capabilities, what would be the 2 that you would keep?
Breathing and eating, probably. But
that's automated into the system that you are. But in terms of
I don't know quite how to answer the question. I think the things that I think are most important are like just continue, like constant curiosity is a practice of just always asking the question, like, what if? Like I'm annoyingly like asking that question, and everything I read, every interaction, I'm like, what if you did this? What if you did that? Like it's just this sort of curiosity of invention. And then I think the second one would be just listening. I think it's the hardest. It's a really hard skill. And it's one I'm not naturally good at. So it's something that, it's something I aspire to be great at. And to some degree, like I've built peer coaching for myself as a system that forces listening.
Beautiful. A rich and fascinating exploration. Given that you said you're not in the business of advice, still, as we bring this, Aaron, to landing, what parting wisdom would you offer to people listening to Create New Futures?
I think building off of that, and it's sort of a circular self-contradicting, but I think just as leaders, your role is to not give advice, and it's to help other people on their journey and to be their champions. So the irony of it is like my advice is to not give advice and to instead have the curiosity and the interest in helping people, find their own answers. It's better for you, it's better for them, and it's better for society.
Thank you very much.
Absolutely.
Thank you for listening. Aviv always encourages his clients to identify the 1 or 2 ideas they can move forward into action immediately. What will you capture and apply today? You can always begin with a small action and then build momentum over time. When you move forward from an idea to action, you get immediate ROI, return on the time you invested, and return of learning. And then the learning cycle builds the success propulsion. One more thing. You can reach Aviv directly by phone and email to discover how he can help you create a new future for your business and organization. Creating your new future can begin today.